Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this warm summer evening. My name is Dana Buell. I use pronouns she and her, and I'm the Director of Social Justice at First Unitarian Church of Portland. And it is our honor to host this evening's community sneak peek of Reclamation towards the Futurity of Central Albina, Dreamworld Urbanism, presented by Emanuel Displaced Persons Association 2, or EDPA 2, and FutureLab, a team of students in the Masters of Urban Planning program at PSU. Over the last 2 years, members of our social justice program have had the immense privilege to be in relationship with descendants and survivors of Emanuel Hospital expansion who have, for decades, been fighting for restitution for their forced displacement. At First Unitarian Portland, we have a social justice covenant that includes the commitment to seek and follow the wisdom and direction of those who most directly experience oppression and injustice, understanding that our liberation is bound together. The opportunity to get to know and learn from the lived experience of EPA2 and to help amplify the stories, analysis, and demands of the survivors and descendants has been deeply moving and transformative. We have deepened our understanding of the nuances of racism as they continue to operate today in Portland. And we are in solidarity with the descendants and survivors in their pursuit of restitution as justice. So again, it is an honor to host this evening's event, and I'll pass it to Bird of EDPA2.
Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Bird. I represent EDPA2, and for those who may not know, we are a community organization made up of survivors and descendants of the Emanuel Hospital expansion. Our main focus is the enforcement of the City of Portland relocation housing policy and federal restitution agreement connected to this history. I am so excited to have some members of FutureLab with me tonight. For the past 6 months, we partnered with PSU's Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program under the guidance of Professor Megan Horse and a student cohort called FutureLab. We are excited to present this project, Reclamation toward the Futurity of Central Albina, Dreamworld Urbanism. Really briefly, in January 2021, FutureLab coordinated a scope of work with EDPA2 and finalized it in February. We agreed on the following project deliverables. Number one, we wanted to develop a professional report compiling historical analysis, impact assessments, and policy analyses and recommendations informed by a strategically developed community engagement process. After I present the overview of the report, Stephen Greenslad of FutureLab will present our second deliverable. Number two, a story map, integrating GIS data, aerial photographs, and archival evidence with storytelling and photography from EDPA2 members and other resources that will stand as an interactive communications piece that supports the ongoing fight for justice pursued by EDPA2. While I speak, you'll see images tonight that the Fother Family Archive was gracious enough to lend to tonight's event. The purpose of showing these images is to show the life of Central Albina. If you understand the life of Central Albina, then you will understand the death of that life. Right now, I also encourage folks, if you don't have a pen and pad or however you take notes, I would encourage you to take notes because I'm going to present a lot of information in a relatively short time. You may have questions or comments or just feedback, and there is time allotted for that at the end of this presentation. So let's get started. Many others, like Dr. Karen Gibson, have constructed comprehensive data and narratives on the history of Albina as a whole and Black communities in Portland. We drew on that existing body of work and conducted research and analysis of our own, We focused specifically on the Emanuel Hospital expansion area and citizens of Central Albina. We developed a sense of the area both then and now and examined the reasons it changed through policy history. We also studied the history of the community through redlining, Vanport flood resettlement, community activism, including the Portland Black Panthers, the Green Fingers Community Garden Movement, and that photo at the beginning of this presentation of Leila Barnett was taken while she was in the Green Fingers garden, one of their gardens. Our study made it abundantly clear that the neighborhood once thrived with Black-owned jazz clubs, cafes, dry cleaners, markets, churches, charities, daycares, free health clinics, social clubs, political organizations, community networks. In fact, before Vanport Mosaic, there was actually a newspaper and television program called the Albina Mosaic during the 60s, and nearly 3,000 homes anchoring more than 7,000 residents. In the 1950s and 60s, Black households were growing in incomes and home values, building wealth to the point where they surpassed their white Central Albina neighbors on both counts. I'm going to repeat that, and this is an overview of the report. The statistics and data for folks who are driven by numbers are included in the report. In the 1950s and 60s, Black households were growing in incomes and home values, building wealth to the point where they surpassed their white Central Albina neighbors on both counts. At the same time, the city accused this blossoming community of being blighted, and then systematically removed, demolished, and dispersed it over the following 2 decades. In many cases, the city built nothing in place of the homes and businesses they destroyed. In effect, the city created actual blight of their own that has stood unchanged over the 5 decades since. Our community engagement strategy focused on 2 major attributes. First, we incorporated narratives and information from the EDPA2 interviews that were conducted by others last fall. Second, we intentionally designed an engagement process that we hoped would foster a sense of safety and respect by handing over decision-making powers to anyone that FutureLab might interview. We held 1 individual interview. I want to share with you all that EDPA2 shared a list including elected officials and others who are intimately involved with the development of the property on Russell and Williams, to no avail. So we held 1 individual interview, and we supplemented that testimony with the narratives gathered in the fall and the expertise that members of EDPA2 and others expressed during our weekly meetings. EDPA2's expertise extends well beyond our own lives into deep and intimate knowledge of the neighborhood and the historical, institutional, and political dimensions of this project. The walking tour of the Emanuel Hospital Urban Renewal Area also proved a powerful opportunity to listen to compelling and heartfelt stories and memories of the area as we experience what it's become today in real time together. FutureLab struggled alongside EDPA2 to locate where EDPA2's homes once stood, given the erasure of the original street grid. Later on, we will actually hear from members of FutureLab, and hopefully, it's my hope that one of them will talk about their experience on the tour with EDPA2. So as we worked, 3 major themes emerged from this engagement process. Number 1, there was a dense fabric of support networks, institutions, entrepreneurship, and shared community in Central Albina prior to the takings and demolitions. Number 2, the neighborhood was multi-generational and a place where generational knowledge was regularly passed from elder to child, as it had been in Black communities for centuries. And number 3, being forced out of Central Albina was traumatic, and for some, the impacts of that trauma persist and were not always fully realized and processed until later in life. But Central Albina had so much more than simply homes. There were main streets, institutions, cultural centers, and a strong, vibrant neighborhood identity all its own. From our position, we are only able to capture glimpses of the neighborhood. We affirm that between EDPA2 family members sweeping their streets in front of their homes, or Black Panthers fighting for children's breakfast and free health care, or neighbors helping neighbors keep up their homes, and much more, the Central Albina community that our families and friends built, invested in, and enjoyed was cared for, it was curated, and we took pride in it. It's easy to see why. What we lost is profound and heartbreaking. Relating to the present and future. Through our engagement, we saw two things. Number one, the community justifiably does not see the city's attempts at moving forward from the unaddressed harms of the past and present as responsive to our needs and our voiced concerns. The community wonders how the city can move forward without an accurate assessment of the facts and their impacts on the community. Number two, many community members have ideas for how restitution, let me correct that. I would say many members of EDPA2, impacted victim families, have ideas for how restitution could be fulfilled, but they are mired in questions of feasibility and who has ownership over the implementation of possible solutions. Direct repayment for what destroyed homes would be worth today was the top obligation that interviewees agreed is owed by the city. We also did an impact analysis using 3 primary data sources. Now, this is where it gets good, and this is where I assume a majority of tonight's participants are here. We want to know what was destroyed and what's owed. So let's get to it. So we did an impact analysis using 3 primary data sources. Number one, we utilized the property identification files made for the PDC that include property descriptions, lot sizes, assessed values in 1969, among other things. Number two, we used Metro Tax lot data. And finally, we relied upon property value data from the Zillow Home Value Index. We used these data to estimate values for every single legible residential property file in the PDC documents and determined reasonable estimates for real market values in today's dollars. We applied these values to the PDC taken properties and then analyzed and mapped them. But we went a little deeper. We believe that if our homes were standing today, they would likely be worth around $473,000 on average. Now, keep in mind that's on average. And the estimate that I'll present tonight is conservative for reasons that I'll explain in a little bit. So I'm going to repeat that. We believe that if our homes were standing today, they would likely be worth around $473,000 on average. Now, check this out. Many more properties were worth more than $500,000, and more still are worth around $1 million in today's real property value. After subtracting the estimates of what some homeowners were offered for their properties at the time, offers many removed residents did not get. We have to keep that in mind. Many folks, like my grandmother, did not receive anything for her home. We estimate that the total uncompensated wealth loss for the PDC taken properties is almost $45 million. Let me explain something really quickly. So we know that between the decade of 1960 and 1970, PDC took ownership of homes. So that was for that decade, for the Emanuel Hospital expansion. Well, Emanuel Hospital took properties too between the years 63 and 67 for the Emanuel Hospital expansion. It's very important to highlight that and to note that as far as we know, there is no record of the properties that were taken by Emanuel Hospital. So let me go back. The total uncompensated wealth loss for the PDC taken properties is almost $45 million. When we add the properties taken by Emanuel Hospital to the PDC number, the total rises to $89 million. This does not include PDC taken commercial properties. I'm going to say that again. This does not include PDC taken commercial properties like my grandfather's tavern, which we did not attempt to estimate because their valuation data proved extremely complex to analyze. These home valuations and their specifics are detailed on our accompanying story map. So one of the things EDPA2 recognized is when we started talking about and looking at what was lost, we realized we sort of categorize our loss into two categories. One is curable loss, and the other one is incurable loss, and I'll define them and their characteristics now. Curable loss assesses the physical damage or harm resulting from the forced removal of communities and neighborhoods in a targeted and geographical location to accommodate urban renewal projects. Primarily, curable loss addresses the demolition or other destruction of physical structures that provide housing, income, or other economic function within a community. It intentionally assesses the harm from a monetary perspective to arrive at a quantifiable figure for restitution. So examples of curable loss are pretty simple. They're pretty straightforward. They include homes and businesses. So incurable loss are the fundamental elements that sort of sustain, anchor, and enhance a neighborhood. By nature, incurable loss tend to be intangible, but instrumental to the livability, quality, and success of a community. Incurable loss it absolutely cannot be replicated in that it intentionally kills the soul, essence, and therefore the identity of a specific geographic location. That does not mean that incurable loss doesn't hold any value. Indeed, it does. It is equally, if not more so, valuable to curable loss, but often harder to quantify, qualify, and evaluate. Some larger scale data like demographic changes and home ownership rates hint at incurable loss inflicted by the city on Central Albina's Black community, while the conversations gathered through community engagement brought them into the open. Defining these incurable losses is an important part of asserting ownership over our stories, reclaiming our expertise over our experiences, and advancing the cause of holding the city and its partners accountable for the full toll of their actions. Our incurable losses also bring insights into how the city should move toward just restitution for past and present harms. Speaking of present harms, I want to take a moment to recognize that forced removal continues. And right now, a prime example of forced removal is what's happening at the Rosemont Court Apartments in North Portland. The Legionella outbreak has forced people to move. Some members of EDPA2 live in the Rosemont Court Apartments. So they've already endured at least one incident of forced removal. And now in the sunset of their life, they're being forced to move again because of a Legionella outbreak that no one wants to take responsibility for. So incurable loss is vast. For the sake of this report, we've categorized incurable loss into 4 categories. Number 1, rearrangements. The city and hospital exerted oppressive control over the Black community to the point where they continually rearrange people's daily lives and routines, their sense of place and belonging, our overall positioning, diluted our political power, strangled us economically, created a state of permanent dependency in the place of inter-community support, self-sufficiency, and determination, and led to the treatment of Black residents as inhabitants rather than citizens landed in and connected to a specific place and one another. Number 2, another form of incurable loss is emotional disruptions. Friendships were destroyed, networks were upended, our sense of community was gone, community insecurity. There was a drastic experience of love decline due to being removed to areas where, in a lot of cases, our presence was met with hostility and rejection rather than the community embrace. we had experienced in Central Albina. A third component of incurable loss is being destabilized. The community lost our avenues to both check and speak truth to power, as a robust network of Black-owned media could not sustain itself after forced community scattering. The community's right to be kept informed of important news centering issues that we cared about, be kept informed about wider city activities that would impact them, and then hold the city accountable for its actions, would go increasingly unmet as these publications folded. The city destroyed the community's ownership and control of our own affairs and narratives, our own shared sense of place, our base for formal and informal generational knowledge and expertise, and forced the community to rely on external networks, cultures, and systems that were often hostile to our presence, unresponsive to our needs, and unrepresentative of their identity where we were once represented. Even more deeply, it retarded our ability to solve our own problems. As EDPA2 member Ms. Marshall often says, we had everything we needed. Lastly, the fourth category is rerouting and reclamation. Central Albinians were denied the opportunity to build on our successes. Homeowners were intentionally converted to renters. Black-owned community-centered businesses were replaced by white-owned gentrifying businesses without a stake in the community as it was, and thus wealth flowed out of the community rather than circulating within and sustaining it so that it could be passed down to future generations. All the while, nearby white neighborhoods were free to build and benefit from their institutions without outside interruption. School routines and child care networks where neighbors, extended family, and friends lived nearby and were available to look after and show up for one another when in need were destroyed. Cultural traditions have been lost or threatened. All of this led to social isolation and disconnection as Central Albinians were scattered to areas where we lacked safety in numbers and an understanding and welcoming environment around us. Curable losses can, with good policy, be resolved through restitution. Incurable losses might be addressed within a reunited and grounded community that is given just restitution, space, and freedom to rebuild what isn't permanently lost and create new things looking toward a bright future. Now, this is where the role of policy analysis comes in. The policies we've seen the city produce are accompanied by promises to learn from what they call quote unquote mistakes of an openly racist and violent past. What is conspicuous by its absence at the city level is policy focused on righting the wrongs of the past and present through restitution for the Emanuel Hospital expansion survivors. Equity may be a stated priority at local levels of government, but community efforts to move the city toward action have been met with lip service, resistance, denial, and outright opposition and trolling, to be honest. We determined there is so much room for policy to address the compensation due to Emanuel survivors for the rearrangement and violence the city and hospital afflicted for decades. We drew inspiration from modern restitution policies in Evanston, Illinois, and Los Angeles. And I want to mention how local governments around the country with similar histories to Central Albina are taking it within their control to create some form of restitution. Whether or not that restitution is arguable, but the fact is local governments are doing this at the local city council level. It is interesting to me that Portland, with its progressive national reputation, is not doing this. What we learned is that whatever actions the city, hospital, and others take toward restitution, the initiatives must be determined by us, the impacted victim families, be approved and administered by us, the impacted victim families, and provide restitution to compensate people for specific past harms. In collaboration with FutureLab, we have identified and recommended, and again, the report obviously goes deeper into describing and explaining what I'm getting ready to mention. The following policies as a starting point in the pursuit of just restitution for the community. Justice deferred is justice denied. Number one, acknowledge the harm perpetrated against the residents of Central Albina. Honor the history of Central Albina. Provide direct payment for curable restitution and incurable losses. Remove barriers to building Black prosperity in Portland. Create a focused restitution-oriented task force led by members of EDPA2 and other families who have been forcefully removed. Conduct feasibility studies in conjunction with the task force and or direct payments. Number 7, return land. This concludes my portion of tonight's presentation. Our report will outline the specifics of these policy recommendations. And with that, we move to our second deliverable, which Stephen from FutureLab will now demonstrate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bird. I'm gonna share my screen to show, round of applause. Bird, you can't see it, Bird, but we got people clapping here for you. Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen just to show our story map. Okay. Can you all see the words reclamation toward the futurity of Central Albina? Okay, great. I got big head nods from Bobby. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Stephen Greenflade, and I had the tremendous opportunity to work on this project with EDPA2. I'm just going to briefly demo the story map and some of the key details from that this evening. So the story map as a visual communication piece is both an overview of the major themes and conclusions from the report, many of which Bird touched on just now, but it's also a collection of resources for EDPA2 and allies. At the top, we very briefly, I'm scrolling down here, we very briefly introduce the history of the Emanuel Hospital Project and EDPA2 before moving into a series of images that show the scale of the devastation that was brought upon Central Albina as a result of urban renewal. And so we'll get to these. That's called the overhead glimpse here. So the first image is from 1948, the year catastrophic flooding destroyed Vanport, incidentally, which sent a huge wave of predominantly Black refugees into Albina. The image is cut off to the east, as you can see, but it does show the majority of the Emanuel Hospital Project area, which is outlined in white here. And along with the surrounding residential areas to the west. And here we can see a fully intact residential neighborhood. The next image is from 1960, at which point Central Albina was a majority Black neighborhood with a thriving business district and jazz scene and strong community institutions. Here it is. Though the impact of urban renewal can already be seen with the development of I-5 right through the neighborhood here. The following image is from 1975. Now keep in mind, it's just 15 years later. And at this point, the entire neighborhood has been demolished for the Emanuel Hospital Project. Over 300 homes and businesses demolished for this. And you can also see the impact of multiple freeway projects. We'll just do this one more time here. Take you to 1960 and then to 1975. So whole scale demolition of the neighborhood. Hopefully this next image will work. I've been having trouble with it today, but in 1996, there we go. The city began planning the interstate corridor urban renewal area. And at that time, much of the original hospital expansion zone was, as you can see, still vacant, including the Hill Block site at the corner of Williams and Russell down here on the southeastern corner, which was once the heart of the Black business district in Central Albina. And this last image is from last year. It's basically what the area looks like today. And these images speak to one of the core observations of our report. As you can see, a lot of this area is just surface parking, and there are still some very sizable vacant parcels. But one of our core observations was, as Bird mentioned, that racist real estate and urban renewal practices were the cause of blight in Central Albina, not the cure. So the next major resource here on the story map is a timeline. You can spend a lot of time looking through this. It details policies and events that have shaped Central Albina from 1857 all the way to today, including local and federal policy, along with community responses to racism and forced removal. The timeline has over 150 entries with links and media detailing the extensive policy history surrounding the project. So I won't really get into too much detail, but you can see there's just so many entries here with links and all the background policy research performed for this project. Below the timeline, we have a redlining map. And below that, I mean, it's important to note, that this area, disinvestment is always paired with these, displacement forced removal projects. So Central Albina was heavily disinvested prior to the urban renewal area. But then below that, we have a map that we produce, an interactive map that shows a number of urban renewal projects that happen in the Albina area. And if you click on each of these outlines of these different projects, you can actually see, the years when they happened and then the approximate number of homes demolished. And a key takeaway from this layer is that over the course of less than 30 years, more than 1,000 homes were demolished in a neighborhood with, at its max, had 6,000 residents, more or less. So, I mean, we're talking about extraordinary devastation in terms of the loss of residential stock and commercial buildings. So next up, we have a kind of a pretty brief overview of our community conversations and impact analysis. We make a brief mention of incurable losses here in the story map, which Bert said a lot about. But I have to say that this concept is fundamental to this project, and it's expanded upon at great length in the report. So please look out for that. However, one key resource within the story map down here at the bottom, this is actually a pretty interesting map from the PDC at the time, which shows all the parcels that they took in the late 60s and early 70s. And then here, if you zoom in, this actually has the name of the property owners and the size of the lots. So we actually took this and other archival documents and produced an interactive story map, or excuse me, an interactive map, which houses the property value estimates that we performed for this project. So you can actually click on any of these orange tiles, which are the PDC taken properties, and you can see the address and the property owner's name, the lot area, and then how much we estimate that property would be worth today. And then at the very bottom, there's a link. So if you click on the link, it'll take you to the original property identification file for that property. And these have a lot of information, including a property description and images of the buildings that were on the property and more. So that's a key aspect of the story map. But it's important to keep in mind that the estimates that we produced are truly incapable of covering the full scale of curable losses. The financial impacts on renters and businesses were things that we're not able to estimate on this project, as well as people who were kicked out of their homes essentially through predatory real estate practices who don't necessarily show up in the Portland Development Commission data. So these impacts were compounded also in multiple important ways by the many incurable losses identified in the report that really have to do with the loss of the community institutions and the networks that made Central Albina so strong. Nonetheless, in this map, you can see some key details about the properties, as I already mentioned. And below that, we have a spreadsheet. Here's a nice little slider which shows the then and now, so you can see what the area looks like today versus 1960. And at the very bottom, we've got a link to the full report, which will be available in a couple of days, I believe. And then we also actually have a spreadsheet which shows a lot of the key details, including our property value estimates and other important metrics from our impact analysis. And in a second, I'm going to pass it to Jude and Ariel to give some of their reflections on working on this project. But I want to say one thing that really blew me away working on this project was when you dive into the enormous amount of evidence that exists, it just blew me away how much specificity there is in the historical documents. We know exactly whose homes were destroyed, some of whom are with us this evening. And with reasonable accuracy, we can estimate what those homes would be worth today. For decades after an entire Black neighborhood was wiped off the map for quote unquote urban renewal, what was once the heart of Central Albina was left empty. But now the area around the Emanuel Hospital project is prime real estate and has become wider than the city of Portland as a whole. Portland has profited handsomely off of land that was taken through the involuntary removal of Black people. We know who did it and we know who was harmed. So why can't we commit as a city to try to make it right? Thank you for your attention tonight. I'm going to pass it now to Ariel to share some reflections on this project.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for sharing the work that we've been able to do with EDPA2. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Ariel. I'm one of the graduate students to work on this project in collaboration with EDPA2. Primarily, my role was analyzing the historic and existing policy and then developing recommendations for future action. Yesterday, Bird asked us to speak a bit on our personal reflections and the impact of the project on us. And the first thing I thought of was I needed a new set of glasses after all the documents that I read. But jokes aside, the level of commitment to this community and also personal history and this movement for local restitution from the folks who worked with us every week has really cemented that the political is personal and vice versa, and it's lifelong and it's intergenerational in a way that even if I haven't been able to experience it personally, I'm thankful to have been able to learn about and discover with them through tearful Wednesday night meetings to tours of where their homes once stood. They really shared a lot of themselves to bring this project into fruition. And for this to be a culminating professional project for us and to contribute to the effort of such a tremendous group of individuals, it's really indescribable. Second, Stephen alluded to this, the city of Portland has an extensive archive, and it's not without its limitation, but my point is that Portland as a government, but also as a community, has in so many ways really said the quiet part out loud, and it's publicly available if you know where to find it. So much of our project really relied on these publicly available materials, and it truly demonstrated that urban renewal, declarations of blight, and community preferences have had a clear and very explicit racist history, which continues, as you've seen today, to impact far beyond the dates of activation and the closure of the Emanuel Hospital expansion project, but that there also hasn't been much in the way of accountability since then. And lastly, I'll try to wrap up. As student planners, we're taught to think about equity in the future, but this project, it looks towards the past and the future, and really highlights that Portland and the broader urban planning sphere is not doing enough to correct for past action or inaction in the plans and plan making processes that we've inherited, and that there's a need for reflection on a personal but also a professional level, that without moving beyond the acknowledgements that we often hear and toward restitution, the act of bringing back what would have been if planners, mayors, elected officials hadn't interfered, we really can't build an equitable future. And so thankful to EDPA2, thankful to be able to share with you all tonight, and I'll pass it to Jude, who will finish with his reflection.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Thank you all for being here and for listening to this presentation of the work that we've been doing. FutureLab has been doing in collaboration with EDPA2 for the last 6 months. It has been a labor of love and a distinct honor and privilege to engage in conversations that highlight to be trusted, to be brought into this conversation, and to be trusted with people's struggles and their trauma surrounding the forced removal from Central Albina. That trust is an honor that I will never forget. So just to highlight a few things that I did, I did my own sort of individual walking tour and took photos of the area today and journaled my own sort of thoughts and observations, and we used those in the report, as well as I think a little bit in the story map to sort of highlight what was versus what is by showing what is on the ground. I sorted through historical archival photos from a variety of sources and paired them with the present day photos as well for the report. Went through the Portland State's Rutherford collection, which provided Black newspaper archives of the history of this particular time period, including newspaper ads for businesses, community events, photos of life in the neighborhood, and community perspectives on the major events that were happening at the time that brought everything about. I also extracted and analyzed demographic data from the US Census, American Community Survey, particularly focusing on incomes, home values, rent to income ratios, population, race, housing units, and owner occupied unit counts, as well as some others. And then help put together the map showing the 7 major quote unquote urban renewal projects that were foisted upon Lower and Central Albina between 1950 and 1980 that saw so many houses demolished and so many families and individuals forcibly removed. And what I learned, I learned some big things. One, probably the biggest impression was during the walking tour with EDPA2 members that we took. I believe it was back in April, and just following Bobby and Liz through the street grid that has been completely changed, that looks nothing like the street grid that sat there in 1960, and listening to everybody's stories and watching them try to pinpoint exactly where their homes were. And Bobby and Liz and Bird and the members of EDPA2, they are experts on their experience. They are experts on what was in this area. And even they struggled to find exactly where they'd lived their lives, where they'd built community. And it struck me how intensely traumatizing, how intensely alienating that experience is, to not even be able to approach a place where you grew up, a place that you called home, and be able to pinpoint where that was. And so we took some special care to try to figure that out, and took some photos in front of those particular areas, but it was very difficult to do that. And it just highlights how, again, how alienating this experience is and how traumatic it is for folks who were forcibly removed. Yeah, and it just, another thing that really struck me was just how on top of everything else, deeply insulting it was for the powers that be at the time to have called Lower and Central Albina blighted when the area was improved, where from a time where it had been neglected prior to when Black people had made up the majority. But the area was being improved, incomes were rising, Black-owned businesses were thriving, and to call this area blighted and then demolish it, it was just an unbelievable insult on top of a trauma. And then where the city would not tolerate what they called blight, they created blight by leaving empty lots for decades that collect litter today, or creating surface parking lots instead. And it just goes to show that the city valued, the city built its own blight and valued its own misbegotten concept of urban renewal more than it valued the Black people that were thriving and building a community. And that is particularly insulting and tragic. And then, the other piece of this puzzle too that was really sort of teased out in our meetings in FutureLab's meetings with EDPA2 was just the sense that this is also an area where folks had been redlined, and particularly after the Vanport floods, but before that as well. And yet this was a community that was a safe refuge. It was a safe harbor for folks who had to daily engage in a Jim Crow era Portland, in a city that was in many ways openly hostile to the presence of Black people in Portland and had been through policy for decades. And so this was an area where people found safety and community, and And when that was destroyed, they were then subject to being dispersed to areas that were not safe and where they were much more exposed to the daily racism and violence of white supremacy. So these are the huge sort of things that stand out to me and things that I will sort of never forget in the course of working on this project.
I want to thank everyone, too many people to name, quite honestly, who made this project possible and who made tonight possible. I want you to know that I appreciate your efforts. I appreciate particularly the folks who listened and stayed, and they know who they are. I want to thank the folks who support EDPA2, but not even so much EDPA2, but who want to be on the right side of righteousness, who know that this is an injustice and are not afraid to say, wait a minute, we can do this differently. I thank you. I really appreciate everyone's efforts. So a few things I want to say. I mentioned Rosemont Court Apartments. I really need to recognize the residents of Rosemont Court Apartments who are on this call tonight. They are going through hell. If you are not paying attention to Rosemont Court Apartments, I would encourage everyone on this call to do so. Those residents it's fixed income, it's affordable housing. They're having to spend money on water. You know, there's so much going on with Rosemont Court Apartments. The person who has organized residents at Rosemont Apartments is on the call. She is relocating out of the building like a lot of folks are. Once she is gone, EDPA2 is going to assume that leadership role. So Jane, I thank you so much for being here. I want to recognize that. I also want to sort of flip things really quickly because I recognize that everyone may not be able to stay until the end of this presentation, until the end of the questions, comments, and feedback. So Ethel, who is always such a great reminder for what are we asking people to do? What action can people take? They're getting this information, what can they do? Will you please join EDPA2 in raising two questions? Number one, FutureLab have already touched on this, and indeed it's included in the report. Number one, how can the City of Portland, Emanuel Hospital, Profit Portland, and Home Forward, who was intentionally left out of this conversation, but they're just as culpable, how can they declare the same property blight twice? Is that legal? How can they do that? The first time they did it, so here's the deal. Let's put it in context and perspective. You claim the area was blight. You cleared it. You got rid of the blight. You allowed this property at Williams and Russell to remain vacant for close to 50 years because you neglected it and willfully did not develop it. So you basically get to blight the area, sit on it, not do anything with it, and go, oh, well, it's blight again. But this time to the tune of $67 million and the victim families get nothing. How does that happen? Another observation is we were lied to. EDPA2 knew it all along. We knew that the property at Williams and Russell is more than 1.7 acres. But that's the message the city and Profit Portland intentionally misled the public in believing. It was only 1.7 acres included in the 12th Amendment of the Interstate Urban Renewal Area. It's actually 3.74 acres. The property at Williams and Russell is divided into two tax lots. It does not border between Vancouver and Williams and Russell and Knott. It actually is bordered between Vancouver and Williams, Russell and Graham. It includes the Emanuel Hospital owned block just north of Williams and Russell. So now that that property is included in the 12th Amendment amended Interstate Urban Renewal Area, it has access to the $67 million that inclusion will generate. How come nobody's talking about that? So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, and feedback. Dana and Nikki, however you all want to facilitate that, myself, FutureLab, and other members of EDPA2 are on the call to answer questions. Again, thank you all for being here.